Well, what we said in our WHO Commission report, the Commission on Social Determinants of Health, is that inequalities in health arise from the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work and age, and inequities in power, money and resources that give rise to these inequities in the conditions of daily life. So we took a life course approach, looking at the conditions of daily life through the life course, but we also looked at the drivers of the inequities in power, money and resources. So in other words, to come back to your question, I wouldn't look at early child development without also looking at the social and economic policies that relate to inequalities in early child development, and then what inequalities in early child development lead on to in terms of inequalities in education, in the kind of job you get, the income you have, where you live, and all of those things in adult life will of course have an impact on inequalities in health. My starting position is that those inequalities in health between social groups that are judged to be avoidable by reasonable means and are not avoided are unfair, hence inequitable. So the way we use the language, inequalities in health between social groups that are judged to be avoidable by reasonable means and are not avoided are unfair, inequitable. So then the question is, what can societies do? And the evidence suggests a great deal. At the societal level, they can be generous in welfare spending, for example, and what we see across Europe, the more generous the welfare spending, the better the health, and the narrower the health inequalities in general. Now, it's difficult to say cause and effect, because lots of other things might be going on. But I think what we can say, if yours is the kind of country that's generous with its welfare spending, it's also the kind of country that's likely to have better working conditions for people. It's likely to be the sort of place where, if you're unemployed, the unemployment benefits are more generous, but unlike what most people think, oh dear, if we make unemployment benefits too generous, people won't want to work. That's not what the evidence shows. The evidence shows countries with more generous unemployment benefits actually have lower rates of unemployment. Now you can ask which way the causation goes, but I think it relates to better working conditions and the kind of country you are and how you allocate resources. The evidence is somewhat indirect, but I would argue quite powerful, the evidence for a living wage. It relates to a question that I've been struggling with for a long time about absolute inequalities or relative inequalities. Now, in countries of Western Europe, European community, that nobody really has lack of shelter and not enough calories to eat. So in that sense, absolute deprivation has been dealt with. That said, people on low incomes are having to go to food banks to feed their children. So they can bring home calories, but the threat to dignity and the quality of food, and if you're worried about paying the rent, I mean, in Britain, for example, the majority of housing benefit goes to people in work. So they're in work, but they're not paid enough to cover the private rental. So they have to have housing subsidies. So this is somewhere between absolute and relative inequalities. It's absolute in the sense that you just haven't got enough money to live, but it's relative in the sense that it's not destitution of a low-income country's style. It's a threat to dignity. It's a threat to self-esteem. It's a threat to what you can give your children and how you relate to your children and your families. And all of those things are vitally important. Now, what we're seeing in Britain, for example, that over the next 5 years, the family type that will have an income most below the minimum income threshold, the minimum income you need for a healthy living, the family type that will be most distant from that is single mother with children, or even next is two parents with two children. So the one who will get closest is a single person with no children, but the further away is families with children, and particularly a single mother. So there we've got a situation where predictably families with children won't have enough for a healthy life. Now, there's indirect evidence that that will damage their health, starting with the quality of early child development, which we'll get to in a moment, but the quality of food, how you relate to people, and so on. One of my key insights and a key feature of the Marmot Review in England and the European Review of Social Determinants of the Health Divide is that health inequalities are not confined to poor health for the poor and good health for everybody else, but follow a gradient. So the data we have from England classifies every neighbourhood in England by degree of deprivation, and the more affluent, the longer the life expectancy. The gap between the 5th centile and the 95th centile was 7 years. For disability-free life expectancy, the gradient is steeper, and the gap between the 5th and the 95th centile is 17 years. So it means that people at the top are living on average about 12 years of their lives with disability, and people at the bottom 20 years. So the inequalities in health are not just in length of life, but in quality of life, and they're bigger for quality of life. And that gradient phenomenon, the higher you are, the better your health, the lower you are, the worse your health, we see right across Europe, no question. But the magnitude varies. We have data, different investigators have different data, show slightly different things. But we looked, for example, at life expectancy at 25. And in Sweden, there's the longest average and the shallowest gradient. So if you look by education, the difference between those with university education and those with only primary education is quite small in Sweden, in Norway, in Italy, in Malta. Go east, Estonia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, lower average and a steep gradient, a huge gap between those with primary education and those with university education. Now that's very important, because the fact that you can get variation over time means that this is not fixed. There will always be inequalities in society, and inequalities in health follow those social inequalities, but the magnitude can change, and it can change between societies. And for example, recent US data, but we have similar data from Europe, recent US data showing the rise in mortality in 45 to 54-year-olds in non-Hispanic whites showed the fewer the years of education, the steeper the rise. So the inequalities are getting bigger. So inequalities can increase over time, and they can vary between countries. So if some countries can have smaller inequalities and some can have increase over time, this should be encouraging, suggests that there are things we can do to address it. Well, in my English review, the so-called Marmot review, I had 6 domains of recommendations that feature in our European review as well. Early child development, education and lifelong learning, employment and working conditions. The 4th that we've discussed already, everyone should have the minimum income necessary for a healthy life. The 5th is healthy and sustainable places in which to live and work. And the 6th is taking a social determinants approach to prevention. So in other words, you don't just say don't smoke. You deal with the drivers of why there's a social gradient in smoking. You don't just say don't eat so much, don't be fat. You deal with the fact that obesity follows the social gradient, so social determinants approach to prevention. Now, when we look internationally, and given what I said earlier, I would also add the inequities in power, money and resources that give rise to inequities in these 6 conditions of daily life. So I would say there's a great deal we can do. I was asked by a parliamentary committee this morning, why aren't we doing it? And I said, well, obviously they're in a better position to answer that question than I am, but it hasn't assumed high priority because, for example, it's predictable and has been predicted in Britain that child poverty will increase over the next 5 years. Well, that's a political decision. That's not inevitable. That's the government saying we're going to reduce welfare spending and we're going to change the tax and benefits system so it benefits the better off, not the worst off. Well, that's a political decision. That will increase inequalities and increase child poverty. Other things equal, that will have an adverse impact on early child development, which is likely to feed through the life course into an adverse impact on health inequalities. That's a political decision. And people like me, I see my job as showing the evidence. I'm not an elected politician, so nobody elected me, but my job is to, as I did this morning in the Mother of Parliaments, make the case that we need action, not out of political prejudice, but out of the case for improving health. And we know what to do. I've identified them in my reviews. Let me start with the example in England of the English city of Coventry. They've declared themselves a Marmot city. They've taken my 6 recommendations and said, we in Coventry are going to do it. And they did it for 2 or 3 years, and they asked, was I happy for them to be a Marmot city for another 3 years? Yeah, of course, I'm very happy. That's great. And it was taken on by local government, not the health people, but local government. Well, that's great. But we need national action as well. And let me illustrate with early childhood. The evidence really is pretty clear that parenting makes a difference to the quality of early child development. The input from parents, cuddling, talking, singing, playing, all of those things matter. Children who get more of those things, they develop better cognitively, linguistically, socially, emotionally, behaviorally. But the ability of parents to do those things is influenced by their economic circumstances. So suppose you're a single mother and I go to you and say, you know, you really should read bedtime stories to your children. Your response might be, if I had a bed, I'd read bedtime stories. Never mind having a book. If I had a bed, I'm in a hostel, I'm homeless, I don't know how I'm going to pay the rent. I'll worry about reading bedtime stories when I know I've got a bed at the end of the week. So that's extreme, but the social conditions in which parents are trying to be parents impacts on parenting. Those social conditions are partly affected by what happens locally. Does local government have policies for housing and the like, make good housing available, particularly for families with young children? but it also is affected by national policy. And we've done a comparison, for example, of child poverty in different countries, where child poverty is a relative measure, less than 60% median income, before and after transfers. And you see dramatic differences. Sweden, for example, has a child poverty level before taxes and transfers of about 32%, not very different from Latvia. After taxes and transfers, Sweden's child poverty has gone from 32% to 12%. Latvia's gone from 32 to 25. So in other words, Sweden says, we don't want child poverty. That's bad. We're going to use our tax and benefit system to reduce it. So you need national policy, you need local policy, and then you need things happening in the household. So at every level. Good parenting involves, of course, firstly, the supply of nutrition and stability. But good parenting involves two things, I would say: the presence of the good and the absence of the bad. And they're different. And what I mean by that, I described a moment ago good parenting in terms of reading to children, talking to children, cuddling children, singing, playing, talking, just input, loving, and all the things that go along with loving. And regrettably, we find that that tends to follow the social gradient. The lower people are in income, the less likely they are to do all those good things. And I would say at least in part because of the pressures upon them. The other part of good parenting is the absence of the bad. There's now a body of evidence about adverse child experiences. And adverse child experiences take various forms, but physical abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse, and then family disruption. I mean, mental illness, alcoholism, divorce, separation. And what the evidence shows is the more adverse child experiences a person has in adult life, the higher the smoking rate, the higher the drinking rate, the higher the use of illicit drugs, the more sexual partners. And people who had 4 or more adverse child experiences, about half become perpetrators of domestic violence. And even more chilling, about half become victims of domestic violence. So good early child development depends on the presence of the good, the positive, the nurturing and the like, and the absence of the bad, adverse child experiences. The short-term effects that we see relate to mental illness and suicide. And that's fairly quick. Data across Europe shows that the higher the unemployment level, the rise in unemployment, that on average, a 3% rise in unemployment is associated with a 3% rise in suicide for a country if there's no expenditure on social protection. But the more generous the country's expenditure on social protection, the less the rise in suicide given that rise in unemployment. So in Western Europe, with countries fairly generous in social protection, a 3% rise in unemployment is a less than 1% rise in suicide, whereas in countries of Central and Eastern Europe, it's more like a 2 or 3% rise in suicide. So the acute health effects we see are mental illness and suicide. But then there are longer effects. So when the economy turns down, unemployment doesn't strike randomly. The more years of education, the less likely you are to become unemployed. The fewer the years of education, the more likely you are to become unemployed. And I look at the indignados on the streets of Madrid, and with more than 50% youth unemployment. Now, some of that might be hidden employment and employed in the grey economy and so on, but still high levels of youth unemployment. And I say they're right to be indignant. They're right to be angry as can be, because the implied promise of work hard, study, and then you'll have a job and good conditions has been broken. And people who leave school or university into unemployment, that can affect their lifetime employment. So it can have a long-term effect. So the short-term effect is, we see with mental illness. The long-term effect is more insidious, but it may be more profound. I mean, the so-called minor mental illnesses are really major because they affect so many people. The major ones, the psychoses, don't affect so many people. So it's the minor we're talking about, anxiety and depression, and they're very much related to life circumstances. I mean, the major ones are more complicated. It could be genetic and, with schizophrenia or whatever. But anxiety and depression are very much related to life circumstances. And when economies turn down, you get, for example, a typical scenario. A man becomes unemployed, he becomes abusive, starts abusing his wife and children, drinks too much. That leads to further economic problems. And the woman might get beaten up. She gets depressed. It has an adverse impact on their children's psychological development. They're more likely to depression subsequently. And it's related, I mean, there are other ways it can play out, but it's related to the economic downturn. And, for example, the Dunedin study from New Zealand was looking at genetic predisposition to depression, to mental illness, and there is, the 5-hydroxytryptamine transporter gene. I mean, there are genetic predispositions, but there's an intersection, an interaction between that genetic predisposition and what's going on socially and economically. With an economic downturn, then the people with a genetic predisposition are more likely to get depressed. If the economy is doing well, it doesn't matter if you've got that genetic predisposition, it doesn't bother you. I've been arguing that health and the magnitude of health inequalities tells us a great deal about how well we're doing as a society. You said earlier that life expectancy, health's improved in Spain. Yeah, look at the changes in Spain. It went from being a rather primitive fascist country to being a liberal democracy, with its ups and downs, but nevertheless, it went from fascism to a liberal democracy and reduced poverty and improved conditions, and things improved and health improved. And the improvement in health told us a great deal about what was going on socially. Look at the other side in Europe, at the communist countries of Europe, health was doing very badly. So we knew fascism was bad for health, communism bad for health, because the communist countries were doing badly. What's happened with the collapse of communism has been a mixed picture. Countries like the Czech Republic, Poland, have had dramatic improvements in health, but an increase in inequalities. The former Soviet Union has not done so well. They've had a very rocky health trajectory, but I think that's in part because of social breakdown. They didn't replace communism by something that functioned well. They replaced it by something rather dysfunctional. So that social improvement and health improvement go hand in hand. It's not just that we need investment in the health care sector, we do, but education, social protection, early child development, all vital. Look at climate change. There's good reason to believe that environmental impacts impact social groups differentially. Both climate change and mitigation and adaptation, if not done carefully, will increase inequalities. So I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. We should, of course, do it, but we should have regard to the equity dimension while we're taking a consumption tax, a green tax, right? Economists will tell us how good a green tax is, but it's regressive. If you have to pay a congestion charge to drive your car in, if you're rich, you say, great, gets the poor people off the road. And if you're poor, you say, what choice do I have? I just have to pay it. And, in the longer term, you can adapt. And so I think good health is a consequence of good social development, but we need to do them together as well as taking the environment into account.